Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang, and the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And to properly make sense of the world, you need to have a properly functioning threat detector. Biologists say that threat detection is a basic trait of every living sentient organism. Every being is constantly seeking signals from the world, consciously or unconsciously, to answer the question, is my world safe or is my world full of threats or somewhere in between? So as followers of Jesus trying to make better sense of the world, it's important to be thoughtful, to be conscious about how well our own threat detectors are functioning. And I believe this fundamental need to properly set our threat detection levels, well, it's especially important in this political moment. So to help us do so, I'm super glad to welcome back our founding friend, David French. David, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Always super happy to be back, Curtis. Always.
All right. Well, David, let's get into it because I think it's easy to illustrate the stakes involved in having a healthy threat detector at the individual level. Think of an elderly person with dementia. Their threat detector can be set too high such that they perceive their caregivers as out to get them, to poison them, to harm them. And that's a real problem. Or their threat detector level can be set too low so they are willing to walk onto a busy highway. So those are high stakes. Help us, David, see at the collective level, especially with the American Christian community, why is it so important for American Christians to have a healthy threat detector?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is essentially that a healthy threat detector helps us properly calibrate a response. So if your threat detector is tuned way too high, you're going to live in a state of fear and alarm that's unjustified. That state of fear and alarm is going to rationalize often a reactionary response that gets extremely, extremely aggressive. And so when that threat detector is too high, not only are you living in fear, you often become dangerous yourself because, a great way to think about it is, let's imagine that somebody, and you go down a dark alley and somebody walking towards you is holding a phone in their hand, but you think they're holding a gun and you shoot them because you think somebody's coming at you armed. Well, your threat detector was way off and it made you actively dangerous. And that's one thing that I think is underestimated about when the threat detector is way off in being too sensitive. You can become dangerous yourself because it unlocks, it's like a key that unlocks a lot of extreme behavior that you would not normally exhibit. And then conversely, when the threat detector is too low, you can sleepwalk into disaster. One of the sort of the classic example of threat detector too low would have been you hate to go to this example, but it's just so easy, would be the collective threat detector too low around, say, Hitler. Or for a more recent example, lots and lots and lots of people were not believing Vladimir Putin would invade Ukraine. That's a threat detector too low. And it was almost, Ukraine mobilized almost too late because threat detector too low. And we can do that all day long throughout history. There have been many threat detector too low moments. And so both threat detector too low and threat detector too high are dangerous, so that you actually don't have an easy option here.
Right. Well, and it seems like your example of threat detector too low at a national level was really apt with, Ukraine or Hitler. I think about World War I with threat detector level too high, where nations are set on trigger warnings of just they're mobilizing their troops. They're setting their trains rolling. This means we have to actually launch a preemptive strike. And so, Barbara Tuchman writes so well in Guns of August about at a national level, how entire nations get threat detectors too high. So, okay, that's really a helpful historical example. Let's bring this down to our contemporary political moment in our American nation. Let's talk about our threat detector levels. And I want to really be focusing our attention both to the right and to the left. All right. So let's start by looking rightward, looking at the conservative direction, especially towards the conservative Christian community. How would you evaluate the threat detector levels and how well it's functioning in conservative Christianity today?
Yeah, we're in a spectrum. I would say if you're in the more, I wrote a piece in the New York Times not long ago where I was talking about we really need to sort of separate out the different divisions and quote this category of evangelical,
Yeah.
which is generally an exit poll category, especially when it comes to white evangelicals. But so this is a big group of people and it has different subdivisions. So for example, there's a difference between fundamentalists and between fundamentalists and evangelicals, and that sort of fundamentalism the fundamentalism evangelical divide that goes back to Bob Jones, Billy Graham. And those two groups have different threat detectors. They really do.
Yeah.
Then you have sort of the whole Pentecostal community that has its own kind of threat detector.
Yeah.
And so where I would say where we are is both the fundamentalist community and lots of the Pentecostal community have the threat detector right now set on tilt, that it's set extreme. So America is over. The church is on the verge of systematic persecution. If it's not already facing systematic persecution, the stakes could not possibly be higher. There was this J.D. Vance interview with my colleague Ross Douthat where he talked about January 6th. And the clear implication was, right, January 6th was like on the lower realm of responses, given how angry people are, that it could have actually been a lot worse given how angry people were. So I would say in those fundamentalist in some Pentecostal, especially the very prophecy influenced Pentecostal spaces, the threat detector is really put on tilt. And what that is leaving in sort of the evangelical community and other parts of the Pentecostal community is a lot of confusion, because are they right? Is it that bad? It doesn't feel that bad. There's a lot of confusion. So I would say in the broader world, it's a split between threat detector high and threat detector confused, with a few elements of threat detector proper. It's very hard in evangelicalism to find threat detector too low. That's very hard to find.
Yeah. Well, I think you've written about this, and you and I have talked about this past, that we feel like that threat detector level set at tilt is an improper setting. And so we could just start off the bat by stating our cards at the outset. But, we've often talked about the idea of, look, it's important to understand the other side. And one way to try to understand the other side is try to make their argument in a way that they would actually agree with. They would actually say, yeah, you've properly stated my view. So I'm going to invite you to do that, David, right now.
Yeah.
So for the Pentecostal and fundamentalist Christian who has that threat detector level set at tilt, make the best case for that setting as an accurate setting.
Yeah, I would say they would say something along the lines of, look, we're in a cultural moment where the very definition of male and female is up for grabs. Even worse than that, if you hold to a traditional view of male and female, there are some spaces where you might find it difficult to work, to have a job, to speak freely. If you dare to say something like there are two genders, we live in a world in which the large majority of Americans believe in some degree of permission for abortion, for not, even some overwhelming majority of Americans believe in abortion rights to some extent, with a majority believing in abortion rights almost up to the moment of birth, under certain circumstances. That there is a big tech hegemony in which the public square is sort of concentrated into the hands of a few people. Those few people could turn off your access to the public square on their whim. You would say that the world right now is very unstable. There's a hot war in Europe. There's a hot war in the Middle East. There are war drums beating in the Pacific between China and Taiwan. And they would say we just came out of a COVID emergency in which public health authorities were as authoritarian as they were wrong. And they consistently implemented tyrannical or oppressive lockdown regimes in spite of evidence against the lockdown regimes. And that you add all of those things together and it starts to look like a country that is really sliding away. And then you combine that with, for example, declining marriage rates, declining church attendance, increased deaths of despair. And what you have is a country that is losing its soul, that's losing its power abroad, that is losing its ability to discern reality. And it is lashing out not at the people who are the architects of its doom, but it is lashing out at the people who are crying the alarm. I think that would be the case.
That's not bad. And some of it I was like finding myself, well, there's a grain of truth in it all in what you've said there. So help us sort through that, because I don't think it's very productive or helpful either for the other person or for yourself to just say, to completely quash that sentiment, quash those feelings. We have to be able to have some ability to sort through them, to sort out, but what if that actually contains some truth? What if that is overblown? Start the process anyways, sort it through for us, David.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to sort through this. One is to sort of say, and I forgot to add this element, which is really, really important, and that all of the things I described are worse than in the past. So this is an element that's very, very important to all of this. And I should
we're at a pivotal moment in which this is the worst it's ever been. Yeah.
Worst it's ever been. And so there's a couple of responses. One goes back to that initial element and what you say. And one of the reasons why that time-based analysis is really, really important is that negative arc and negative the creation of a negative arc is very fundamentally important to this worldview. And so one of the things that, and it's also very prominent amongst younger Christians. They don't have longer life experience. They probably came of age or might have come of age after the end of the Cold War, for example. And so they have an experience of, when they're very young, of this incredible peace and prosperity. And then we move to the Great Recession. Then we move to, the COVID emergency. And so there's been just a lot of adversity that they have faced. And they have a view from their childhood of something better, more settled, more simple, more peaceful. But me, I have a bigger view. Right. And so what my larger view says is that America is always divided on really fundamental questions. It's been, some of the divisions of the past were so dramatic. They were far more violent and contentious than the divisions, say, over trans rights.
Yeah.
Or LGBT rights. I mean, you had like the Philadelphia Bible riots, for example, in the 19th century. You had people being killed over these kinds of divisions. And so America's always been a country that has had really fundamental divisions. And America is always a country that has been tempted towards a punitive and pugilistic response to divisions, as opposed to a pluralistic and accommodationist response. This has always been kind of a tug of war. You go back and you look at the mass imprisonment, say, for example, of anti-war protesters in World War I. You go forward to the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. You, against a backdrop of Jim Crow for decade after decade. And so you look at this current situation and the current disputes, and you say, on a historical basis, the disputes are sharp, but they're being conducted in a way and that is contentious, yes, and has abuses, yes, but is, relatively speaking, preferable to the way we have fought through a lot of these disputes in the past. So it's not that we don't have sharp disputes over very important things. And it's not that there aren't extremists on both sides who go too far in advancing their point of view. It's just that if you think that our divisions right now are sharper and more contentious than they have been in the past, that's just wrong. That's just really wrong. And if you think you have fewer civil liberties to vocalize your beliefs and your statements and your disagreements than you had in the past, that's wrong as well. Yep. So it's not that the differences are not important, and it's not that there aren't extremists who would suppress the civil liberties of those they disagree with. It is that this is not new and often much less severe than even the relatively recent past. And so, in that sense, the differences aren't necessarily growing sharper or more violent or more severe. It's that our alarm in response to them has grown greater, or our lack of perspective makes our alarm disproportionate.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And so that's one axis, which is a lot of this depends on a negative arc. And then the other axis is, I think it's also very important to say, even when the complaint is real, very real, we do have declining marriage rates. We do have increased deaths of despair. The answer to that does not require the extremism that's exhibited.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in fact, the extremism that's being exhibited can often contribute to the underlying cultural malaise and angst that creates many of these problems to begin with. So some things that are extremely serious that you should not in any way sort of say, oh, it's not as bad. It's not so. Some things are bad and getting worse. Extremism is not necessary to address them. And in some ways, extremism makes those problems worse.
Yeah.
And so I think that's another element to that as well.
David, that's really helpful in terms of diagnosing how our threat detector levels can get askew. And you're drawing from the conservative side to illustrate it, but just to call it out. So you're saying one thing is it's really important to have a proper time perspective on your threat detector. What is the time arc of this? That's super helpful. And then also you still have to differentiate your threat detector from your response setting, right? Like,
yes, exactly.
Right. So your threat detector could be whatever, but that doesn't necessarily dictate, even if your threat detector level tilts towards tilt, it doesn't mean your response level has to go towards tilt. So those are some helpful distinctions. I want to ask you to think about another kind of distinction, which is thinking about our threat detectors along a spectrum rather than a binary, on or off switch. Because it strikes me that among many conservative Christians, they are talking about genuine issues or problems, but they immediately set then the threat detector level to it's either off or on, or maybe another way to put it is America as a Christian nation, or I'm getting persecuted. As like those are the two settings you toggle between. And actually, in reality, there's a range of settings in between. America is a fully Christian nation that fully endorses and even backs up with laws my Christian beliefs, and a nation in which their state structures are actively persecuting me for my beliefs. So talk about this toggle on or off binary and why we need to have a more spectrum nuanced threat detection mechanism.
That's right. I mean, it's not a binary on or off where it is I'm fine or it's an emergency. It's not like that. It can be I'm worried about this and willing to take steps A, B, and C to deal with it, but not that I'm terrified of this and willing to go all the way to Z to deal with it. That there is a profound difference between a measured response and an extreme response, a calibrated response and an extreme response. And you bring up the P word, persecution. And I think this is a word that very much looms large in the Christian imagination. And in an interesting way, you almost see sort of a persecution hunger from people that they want to put themselves in the position of I am a persecuted heroic warrior for the faith, right?
Right.
Well, my view on that is if you've actually experienced persecution, there would be no persecution hunger, because that's horrible.
Yeah.
Actual persecution is horrible. If we're talking about I'm getting attacked, people are saying mean things about me, or people are angry at me, a lot of that can be very unpleasant. But often what they're describing persecution is really just one side of an argument. Because if you turn around and ask the person that they're claiming is persecuting them, hey, what's your experience in dealing with Christians in public life? They would tell a story that sounds a lot like persecution of all of the conduct that the Christian side of the fight, especially sort of the right-wing Christian side of the fight, is ascribing to the left as evidence of how the left persecutes Christians. All of that conduct, the left could say of the Christian community. So there are individual instances of second-class treatment, but I think if you're going to say the church is persecuted, you have to really make the case for systemic second-class citizen status.
Yeah, especially by the dominant power structures, especially by the state. And this is where it feels like, Christians who appeal too quickly, too easily to justify or to narrate their own experiences as persecution, it really feels like it's dishonoring the truth of that word, because that word really should be reserved for people who are actually experiencing, like you said, state sanctioned or heavily structured and systemic opposition, sanctions placed on them for their beliefs. And that is actually happening throughout the world. And so, for Christians in other parts of the world, that's actually, and so when American Christians sort of adopt that label of persecution for simply, I'm getting opposition, I'm getting people mad at me, I feel like we're not actually being true brothers and sisters with our truly persecuted Christians who deserve actually to use that word, and we are diluting and diluting that word by claiming it for any kind of opposition, right? Because like you said, persecution is real. We actually have to preserve a meaning for that word that's accurate and reserved for when that's actually happening. Otherwise, that word starts to lose its actual meaning for when we need to use that word. Also, David, it seems to me like it's another distinction to make on this sort of spectrum level is to really make a sharp distinction between persecution and not being in power. Those are two different things, right? Like,
or annoyance,
right? Yeah. I mean, because I think it's clear, at least to me, that Christians have, let's say, you talk about the time mark compared to 50 years ago, have less cultural, political power. I think that's fairly
white evangelicals. Yes,
white evangelicals. Sorry, I meant white evangelicals have less political. But to equate that with persecution, then actually is conflating two very different terms. Can you just sharpen that distinction and say why? I think we don't need to make the case for the loss of cultural, political power among white evangelicals, but draw the line for, just make this quick argument for, hey, this is why Christians really should try to be very sparse with using the persecution. Like, what's the actual state of civil liberties, of religious rights among Christians today?
Yeah, I will tell you, there is no question that if you are a white evangelical or a white Protestant, that world for you is different than it was. There's no question. But the world that existed for you 50, 60 years ago, or 70 years ago, was unjust for other people. Yeah. You had so much power and authority that it was actually unjust for other people, including other Christians. Yeah. So, for example, if you rewind the clock, not too long ago in American history, sort of the white Protestant establishment, especially in places like the South, really had an enormous amount of power over whether elementary school kids in public schools were going to pray, what version of Bible would they read, what kind of displays were in the public square. And so if you were in a minority faith, including Catholic, by the way, or if you're a Black Christian, or, you rewind the clock 100 years and the world is just really different. It's really different. The white Protestant establishment had an enormous amount of power, even over your faith practice. Okay. Mm-hmm. And even over their matters of faith, if you disagreed. And that's all changed now. That's all changed. And so people experience loss of power, and they also experience loss of status, sort of from alpha to equal. And a loss of status from alpha to equal is experienced as a loss. Yeah. So there's been a loss of power and there's a loss of status. And a lot of people have equated that with persecution. Right. But really, it was justice, because your power and your status were at the expense of other citizens who deserve equal treatment under the law. And it's really only in the last 100 years in American life and the incorporation of the Bill of Rights to the states that especially accelerated in the post-World War II period, that you've really begun to see full realization of the concept of equal protection of the laws. And if you were alpha, equal protection is a loss.
Right.
But it's just. And so that's what I think a lot of people are wrestling with here. There is an actual genuine loss, but that loss should have happened. It was necessary to happen. And so for it to happen. And so this is one of the things the Christian nationalist crowd is very upset about, is this loss. But I think it's worthless to sort of say, no, there's been no loss. Of course there has been a loss, but it was a loss of an unjust, it was the loss of unjust power. And now it's the creation of legal equality. And that legal equality, if you were in the alpha position, legal equality feels like you're lesser, you're diminished. But if you were in the beta position, legal equality is a tremendous just upgrade.
Yeah. Well, David, we've been talking about threat detection getting askew when you overly maximize the threat. Are there ways in which, as you look at American evangelicals, especially maybe that tilt conservative, are there ways that they're minimizing threats? Are they missing or not actually detecting properly threats? And I'm thinking especially at a threat detection level turned inward. Like, what is all of this political threat maximization doing to us, doing to our own? That the threat detection shouldn't just be externally focused, but there should be a mirroring function to our threat detection. And so can you say a little bit about what you're observing there?
Yeah, so we have it totally backwards, Curtis. The threat detection right now is tuned to tilt on everything outside the church, and is tuned to ignore on everything inside the church. And they're related, right? So if the threat is outside, then unity, internal unity, and shared purpose becomes incredibly important. If you're confronting a hostile army, you don't want your army to fall into 3 warring factions, right? So you need to rally all the troops. And so what ends up happening, and this has been going on for more than a generation, actually, and it's been hard for me to see it in part because of the tactics employed. And that is that every time there's a Harvey Weinstein, say, on the left, or there's, awful sexual decadence on the left, that gets amplified. That's absolutely just streamed into your Facebook feed, streamed onto your religious television that you're watching, and it all reinforces that they're bad. They are bad. So Me Too, in many ways, vindicated a lot of evangelical critiques of the sexual revolution. I wrote those pieces, Curtis. Like, this is where your completely consent-based morality leads you, is to the sexualization, essentially, of everything. When your only metric for sexual morality is consent, then that has the potential of sexualizing almost everything. And there has to be a higher sexual ethic, and Christianity offers a higher sexual ethic. And so there's a lot of good stuff to be said about what was happening in the secular world. And then a lot of Christians had no clue that all of, or many of the most prominent Christian institutions in America were rife with their own sexual corruption,
right?
Just overrun with it. And how did they not know? Because an enormous amount of work had been done to make sure that nobody would know, from NDAs, from confidential proceedings, from holding back information from law enforcement. So if you go back and you look at, just think in the last 5-6 years, what we have seen one of the 2 largest Christian universities in the country, Liberty. You lift a rock on Liberty, and it's a cesspool of corruption, subject to one of the highest fines directed at a higher education institution in American history for covering up crime on campus. You look at the Ravi Zacharias ministry. You look at Kanakuk. You look at the Southern Baptist Convention. Now you look at Gateway Church, the largest church in America, and you just go through, and if we had the same set of facts in the secular organizations of the same prominence, we would say that's evidence, proof of the rottenness of those institutions. Right. But we will not do that for our own institutions. We apply a lesser standard. And so that minimizing threat detection, what that actually ends up doing in the most tragic and horrible and awful of ways, is that it enables continued abuse.
Yeah.
And it means that there are going to be there are going to be people who are going to be abused in the months and years to come, because religious institutions have willfully turned a blind eye to the prevalence of it and have willfully failed to implement many of the measures that are necessary to protect their own congregations and their own
Well, you
members.
saw this dynamic tragically in the most recent Southern Baptist Convention, where so much energy is devoted toward to protecting the denomination against the encroachments of a sort of so-called feminist agenda that might threaten their doctrine on whether females can be pastors or not, the law amendment. So much energy. And then almost quietly, there's this news announcement that the task force that had been formed to actually address widespread systemic church abuse is getting disbanded. It's like, that's sort of in institutional terms, you see this, minimizing the threat internally, and we're maximizing the external threat. And what I think what you're saying is those two are almost, there's a symbiotic relationship between those two dynamics, because you're justifying the minimizing of the internal problems that really should be threats to your own soul, by saying, no, we can't afford to do that, because that'll make us seem weak, or will undermine us as we are facing this external threat.
A perfect example is I went, before we had the podcast, I thought, you know what, I'm going to do something a little fun. I'm going to go and I'm going to look at some of the biggest Christian nationalist or right-wing culture war Twitter accounts, and see if they have dealt with this gateway church issue at all. At all. So for listeners who don't know what this is, there was a pastor of a church that has 100,000 members. I mean, giant church, by some measures, the largest in America, who turns out that he molested a 12-year-old when he was a young pastor, and then cast that as having an inappropriate relationship with a young lady in previous years. And then he was restored by the church and forgiven by no, he committed a crime that was covered up by the church. Yeah. This wasn't a restoration reconciliation deal. This was a crime and a cover up. And he resigned yesterday, finally, after, decades and decades after the abuse, and after some really weird messaging about it. But so I went and I looked, this is a big deal. This is the biggest church in America. These people would not, under any circumstances, ignore a pedophilia scandal at one of the biggest progressive nonprofits. They would not ignore that in a million years.
Right.
I think I saw one person addressing it kind of clearly and unequivocally. Wow. And she was not exactly fully in the Christian nationalist camp, sort of one toe into it, Christian nationalist type person. But the rest is just totally ignored. But you know what the real problem is, Curtis? Russell Moore's tweets. Like
our friend Russell, he's
our friend again. Russell. Like, they will get on that, and gang tackle over that stuff. Anything far left, anything they detect as weakness on the right, they will go after that. But they the ignoring of these scandals is just remarkable. It's remarkable. I mean, also, this guy was prominent in the Trump faith community. And so it's fascinating. And they will wear you out for days over what they think of as bad tweets. And they will just not say one word about substantial scandal within the church. And a lot of that is based on an actual ideology or an actual position they either hold explicitly or implicitly, which is called netter, no enemies to the right. In other words, the left is so bad. The left is so bad that anyone on the right, the true right, what they would call the true right, they would not consider somebody like me on the right. The true right, in their view, they're not gonna touch it. And because it's just more important to take on the left, and it undermines the cause if you punch right.
We've been spending a lot of time about how threat detection and getting it set properly is so important to make sense of the world, and how, in our first part of our conversation, how conservative Christians can get that askew, can get that tilted off its proper settings. David, let's actually turn leftward towards more
Yeah.
progressive leaning Christians. And let's make that same evaluation. How is threat detection working in that part of American Christianity?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So first, it's hard to find. There are progressive churches, but even if you look at mainline denominations are not monolithically left, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
If you know, they're much more politically diverse than your median evangelical church, but they're absolute intolerant elements of leftism, and those intolerant elements of leftism are not confined to secular leftism. So what I would say is you don't necessarily have that large of a truly far left Christian community. It's really pretty small. But you do have a large far left community,
Right.
That's pretty big. And it has demonstrated, and the Christians who are part of it have been swept up into this, an enormous amount of intolerance and extremism. And one of the areas, where I'm most intimately familiar with this is in higher education.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of conversation about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is an area where misperceived or improper threat detection leads to extreme responses. And there are a lot of people that I have encountered, that you have encountered, Curtis, that would basically say America is just about as bleak as it was in Jim Crow. I mean, like, they have the bleakest possible view of the United States of America. This is actually one of my prime critiques of sort of critical race theorists, is it's when they look, a lot of critical race theory for me is fascinating when it looks at the systemic effects of past discrimination, like the continuing systemic effects of past discrimination. But a lot of critical race theorists have this dark view of the American present and a dark view of the American future that rationalizes and justifies, measures that are quite frankly illiberal and often incredibly punitive and harsh themselves. And so, I wrote this piece in the Times about, the DEI world. Like, we should appreciate diversity. We should strive for equity. Inclusion is a good value. But if that's going to mean shutting down the free speech of people with whom you disagree, ending the due process rights of, for example, or severely diminishing the due process rights of male students in sexual misconduct cases, or gross racial discrimination against Asian applicants, like those kinds of things are in many ways justified, rationalized by this incredible sense of emergency and threat. Yeah. And so that overwhelming sense of threat means we got to get rid of free speech. We got to get rid of the due process. We got to get rid of equal protection. It's an emergency. And that results in a cascading additional set of injustices as they punitively focus on their opponents, again, often motivated by this very dark view. There was this of the United States and American history. There was this internet rumor that flew around yesterday that prematurely declared the death of Noam Chomsky, the famous linguist.
Yes,
I don't know if you
MIT
saw
linguist,
this, Curtis.
Yeah.
But if you go back, and it led to a lot of people sort of bringing up his body of work. And I remember arriving at Harvard in early 90s, and I'd never heard of Noam Chomsky. And one of my classmates was reading it, and I picked up one of his books, and I was like, what the heck? This is dark about America. I mean, this is dark, but it really helped me put myself into the shoes of a lot of my far left classmates who were shouting people down and were issuing all kinds of threats and trying to cancel careers, as they were operating against a threat matrix that was unbelievable, unreal in its sort of the darkness of its view of this country.
It strikes me again, also, one thing that unites the right and left, unfortunately, is again the equation of threat with I'm not in power, or my viewpoint is not actually the one that is getting enforced as the preferential sort of worldview here. And it's just striking how much that is the commonality between right and left is, I can't actually tolerate the fact that that in our pluralistic society, there will be disagreements. There will be situations where my viewpoint is not actually the officially sanctioned and empowered viewpoint. And in one way or another, then I have to seize the structures of power to make sure that that happens. And when both sides are doing that, that's an incredibly destabilizing, dangerous. Like that's the actual threat to me that's in place, is that we have devolved into a war of all against all, because we actually cannot, because any difference is viewed as actual threat, right?
Well, I've used this analogy before, and I think it works. So it's this overwhelming sense of threat that was one of the primary motivators for people voting for Donald Trump in the first place. For example, there was this essay written called the Flight 93 election that just went super, super, super viral. And it's literally explicitly made the case, you got to charge the cockpit or we're going to die. That you got to, Hillary Clinton cannot win, because if Hillary Clinton wins, America dies. And that was the argument. Well, and I said, I was talking about this in a debate once. I said, no, what if you charge the cockpit and you choke the pilot to death and you realize that the plane wasn't going down, it was just turbulence. And now you're at the controls of a plane. You don't know how to fly because your threat detection level was way out of whack.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that is happening, is that we're looking at actual problems that exist in institutions that are real, that do exist, but then exaggerating them and then destroying the institutions or hollowing out the institutions.
That's
and
right.
That is a dreadful development.
You're right. And it seems like the left, we are, when you think that the threat detection is so high that you have to seize inappropriately institutional power to marginalize opposing viewpoints, say from the right, you undermine trust in that institution for everyone, such that when you actually need to have that institution be respected, trusted by everyone, then that's gone. And I think, your example of higher ed is a good example of where I think the left has done that by using, power in the institution of higher education to enforce their own vantage points, such that now, more broadly speaking, especially on the right, it just no longer commands that respect and trust. David, what would be other examples of institutions on the left that have suffered this evacuation of trust because of a misappropriation of power, besides higher education?
Yeah, well, there's a lot. There was a really fascinating article by Ryan Grimm in The Intercept. And he was talking about how the ideological conflicts within progressive philanthropy and progressive activist organizations were really crippling these organizations. They were turning inward upon themselves with accusations of racism and racial insensitivity flying, especially around that 2020 time period. And so you began to see a lot of institutions that were making inexplicable kinds of personnel decisions. You were seeing people fired or sidelined for reasons that, were puzzling to somebody who is not inside that sort of progressive bubble and familiar with the conflicts over language. And so you really had a period of time, and I think it's peaked and is receding, but you really did have a period of time where a lot of institutions that leaned left seemed to just go through a radical phase where politics was leaking into everything. And I think one of the worst examples of this was around COVID, when, one of the message from the public health community was no large gatherings, no large gatherings, no large gatherings. George Floyd happens, and it's no large gatherings unless you're protesting racism.
Right.
And it's like, wait a minute, hold on. And, that actually was the foundation for a lot of religious liberty cases was, okay, hold on. You cannot permit gatherings for a political purpose that you agree with and prohibit gatherings for religious purposes. Yeah. And so you saw some of this being used in some of these, in some of these cases properly using the fact that these double standards existed. And so we did go through a phase, and a lot of people who went through it have real scars of absolute intolerance in a lot of left-leaning institutions for any sort of disagreement. And the examples are just so legion, you can't just sit there and describe them all.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think higher education, philanthropy, I'm familiar with enough with that world and the nonprofit sector. I think this,
Parts of
magnification
journalism.
This magnification of the threat of any conservative viewpoint leaking in gets set to tilt in a way that ends up, acting ways that are unfair and ends up draining broader public trust of those very institutions that we're going to need as a society going forward. We
Gotta have
absolutely will
them.
need this. Yeah. David, what about this threat of this danger of setting your threat detection too low? Among progressives in general, and maybe among progressive Christians, what do they tend to minimize in terms of threat detection?
Well, it's sort of the same thing that the right. The interesting thing about horseshoe theory, the reason why a lot of people object to this concept of horseshoe theory, which is that it's as the extremes get more extreme, they get more alike, is they go, wait, well, right-wing extremists are pro-life and left-wing extremists are pro-choice. That's very different.
Yeah.
No, what you're talking about with horseshoe theory is that the extremists behave the same.
Yeah.
For different policies, but they behave the same. And so the very same thing where you see, and I see this anytime I write something critical of the left in the Times, a lot of the blowback is, how dare you? The right is so much more dangerous. That's the real threat. All of this stuff about the left, that's just a few college kids or weird professors or whatever. The real threat is the right. And sometimes it's almost like you cannot write about the right enough to provide cover to write about the left in some circles.
Or vice versa, perhaps.
Or vice versa, right.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same. And so if you're in left spaces, if you write about problems on the left, there will be some people, usually center-left folks, who are like, finally, thank you, somebody is saying this. But the far left folks it's all the same message all the time. How dare you? The right is worse. Yeah. And that's the same thing you get on the far right. How dare you? The left is worse. And so they're totally, they view their own, in many ways, they view their own vices as virtues. Yeah. Because the vices are what are how they're choosing to fight. Yeah. And the fight is the real purpose. And so, when I say horseshoe theory, I do not mean that the two sides want the same policies. What I mean is the two sides behave remarkably similarly.
And one thing we're talking about is how this similarity between the right and left is that we have a tendency to way over exaggerate the threat coming at us externally from the other side, and we way minimize the threat that's happening internally to our very hearts, souls, values as a result. All right, David, we've been talking about this in broad strokes. We're going to take a break now, and after we come back, I want to talk about and get practical and pastoral. What do we do in response to this dynamic that's happening in terms of our threat detection levels? And we'll be right back. All right, I'm back with my founding friend, David French. We've been talking about what's happening in broad strokes, both on the right and left, about how our threat detector levels get really askew. David, let's get personal here. How, as an individual, if we sort of acknowledge, okay, I see this is happening, and probably I am getting swept up in it, how do I properly self-calibrate? How do I properly tune my own threat detection levels so that it's actually capturing reality in a healthy way?
Yeah, the simplest answer to that is read the best expression of the other side. So if you hear a story that's got you charged up, don't just go charge after you've read the story that's got you charged up. Do some work to see if there's another side to that story. Yeah. Is somebody if you're conservative, go and see if something has been written about it in a left-leaning publication. But what happens is people read that and they go, why would the PCA invite somebody who slanders all Trump supporters and attacks the weak? Yeah. Right? And so this is our number one, look, guys, if you're saying, I don't have time to look at all this stuff. Well, there's if you don't have time to look into it all, well, then dial back your own intensity about it.
Right.
Yeah. Only ramp up your intensity when you've got time to actually look at it all. Yeah. But what we have is a bunch of people who are on tilt, but they haven't. And as soon as someone says, I do my own research, I know you actually don't do your own research, but what we've got to read opposing points of view, and not just anything, but you've got to seriously think about and find who are thoughtful people on the other side who are going to give me this picture in full. Because what happens when you do that is it actually calms you down a bit. There's an interesting study done recently where people were exposed who generally had gotten one side of the story, and they were in the experiment exposed to more than one side, and it chilled them out. Because they realized often that the thing that I'm amped up about isn't real. And another thing is this. There is a giant gap right now between how people feel their personal life is going and how people feel that the country is going. And what I would say is, if you have such a giant gap with giant numbers of people in America feeling like their personal life is going well, and they're also thinking the country's going to hell, how are those two things compatible? If the vast majority of Americans are satisfied with their lives to some degree, greater to lesser, but satisfied with their lives, maybe that means you don't live in hell. So that then let's start thinking about, marrying what your view is of your own life with what your view is of the nation. And that maybe the successes in your own life are actually in some ways possible, not just because you're so incredible and awesome and everything. I'm sure you're incredible and awesome, but also maybe because you live in a place that still gives people an awful lot of opportunity to thrive and flourish. Here's a good way of thinking about whether you are truly oppressed or persecuted. If you have the power to be pugilistic, question whether you're persecuted. Okay, so if you have the power to silence somebody, if you have the power to exclude somebody from your community, if you have the power to do that, question how persecuted you are. You might be annoyed, you might be angry, you might be properly outraged, but question how persecuted you are when you have the power to be pugilistic.
I see this really on the right and left in terms of this disconnect between one's own personal experiences of the world and their perception of the world. You ask somebody on the right, like, yes, Christians are being persecuted. And you ask, when have you been persecuted recently? Most often the conversation kind of grinds to a stuttering, because they really can't come up with it. Similarly, on the left, when you think, wow, racism is just, rife and crushing. Okay, that I absolutely don't deny there's the presence of racism in the world. When have you experienced that? Yourself. Again, it's harder to come up with actual experiences of that. And I would say both on right, left. That's not to say those problems you fear out in the world don't exist, but use your own experiences to calibrate properly just how pervasive and how severe that is. I mean, I think it's a really great practice. And then I also really like your practice about gauge your news consumption and sharing levels with how much work you're willing to do.
Yes.
I do think I agree with you, the need to read widely. I think the reality is many people do not actually have the time to do that or the willingness to do that. But there needs to be an implication of that, which is exactly like you said. Well, then don't attach that much emotion, energy, conviction, and especially public promotion, like sharing on your own social networks of that very piece, if you're not willing to do the work to actually vet it for accuracy.
Don't run around with your hair on fire because of memes you saw. This is one of the things that I'm seeing family by family. This is one of the things that is causing a lot of divisions in family is mom or your aunt or your uncle fires someone into the family group chat that is just not correct. It's just not right. And any pushback leads to incredible fury as opposed to openness. Like, oh, I'm so relieved that that's not true. People get angry when they're told it's not true. And so it creates all these additional divisions. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right. We've got the combination of low information and high alarm.
Yeah.
And that's a very difficult thing to deal with.
All right, David, this has been a great conversation. And I want to close here by noting that sometimes our threat detector levels gives us good news that actually what we were feared was going on turns out to actually give us good news. And David, you just had an example of that personally with a figure that's beloved in the good faith community with Nancy. Can you share the good news about something that we had been fearing that our threat detector levels had been picking up? What's the good news here?
Yeah, the great news is that Nancy got the results of a microscopic level biopsy after her cancer surgery. So she's been fighting triple negative breast cancer, which is a very tough form of breast cancer. She's been through 6 months of chemo, had about a month pause, then had surgery to ostensibly remove the remaining cancer in her body. And when they went to the affected areas, they could eyeball no cancer. And it resulted in like a less extensive surgery. And then when they did look microscopically at the areas they removed, they found no cancer at all.
Oh, so
and
good.
So the assessment really is that Nancy is cancer free, but she still sadly has to go through radiation as part. It's just a treatment protocol.
Yeah.
But as of right now, I feel very confident in saying that she's actually cancer free. And that's incredible news. Like we were not told to expect that at this stage of treatment. And so we're just incredibly grateful for that. Just incredibly grateful.
Well, I
And
join
grateful
you
for your
in being,
prayers.
yes. And I've been praying. I know many of our listeners have been praying for Nancy. And so we rejoice in that good news. We're really, really thankful. And we pray for continued good health and protection for her and for you, your whole family. David, thank you so much for this great conversation. And so glad that we get to do this every month.
Yes. Thank you so much, Curtis.
All right, listeners, thank you so much for listening to us, and reminders to leave a review for us, give us some feedback wherever you listen to your podcasts, and reminder to once again next week, join us back here as we gather around the campfire.